Thank you, Michael. Thank you once again. And if it's okay for you, we'll directly start asking our questions.
Yes.
So first of all, what motivated you and your co-author to explore music exchange offices at this specific moment?
Well, let's say that over the last few years, from Portugal to Estonia, a quite significant number of music export projects sprouted up. National brands, state-backed agencies, public-private promo platforms, and they all try to stake a claim in global attention in a way. For instance, France consolidated and reworked its public structure for music export with the Centre National de la Musique in 2020. And the old Bureau Export moved into that orbit with other organizations. Spain runs many public and private initiatives like Sounds from Spain, Catalan Arts, Spanish Wave, and at the EU level, that was also a very important part. There's been an initiative, first called Music Moves Europe, trying to stitch things together through the European Music Export Initiative. So those shifts or those new initiatives were not small changes in the landscape. They were actually changing who gets money, who gets to travel, who gets invited to showcase stages, showing a new direction in cultural policy in Europe. So in 2022, it felt like the right moment to stop and map what was actually happening. And from a personal angle, this was also sort of logical because my PhD dug into how global trends get reworked locally through the case of France and local languages. So the natural flip side was to ask, how do states, organizations, and industries try to push music outwards? And I've always had a curiosity about music circulation, global circulation, and identities. So it made sense.
You argue that the term export can be too narrow and that internationalization is more accurate. Why do you think the economically loaded term export has persisted in both policy and organizational names?
That's a good question. Personally, I've always struggled a bit with the term, but I think the reason why it's used that much, it's because it sells a clear, measurable story to policymakers and funders, even when the reality is actually more complicated. So export refers to sort of attractive language for neoliberal policymakers, and it conjures revenue, trade balances, GDP, and the kind of metrics finance and economic ministries like. It makes a great political slogan. It can promise jobs, growth, IP income, but music's cross-border movement is actually more complicated. Of course, it's cultural. It's also diplomatic in some ways. It's social and economic for sure. And this, let's say that these set of aspects make it much closer to internationalization. So sometimes when we want to go fast, we use export, but when we have the time, we use the term internationalization. It makes more sense. And the article actually shows this tension because music export organizations are often funded from cultural budgets, and they do a lot of non-commercial work, training, curation, reciprocity, but they live in a policy world that loves neat economic narratives. So the word export persists because it's politically useful and easier to create a dialogue with policymakers, and measure, but only rhetorically, even if it doesn't capture what music export organizations actually do in their day-to-day job.
And does the concept of export readiness complicate the work of MEOs, particularly for niche or independent artists?
I would say that export readiness is a tricky term because it can be seen as a gatekeeper, but also as a professionalization tool. Music export organizations and their funders, they use criteria like streaming numbers, social media followers, or recent releases, and the existence of a professional entourage to decide who gets help more than specific music genres. And that makes them pragmatic and business oriented, sure, but because you don't want to throw away public money by supporting projects who don't stand a chance to reach anything, but it can also sideline artists who don't tick those boxes. So the paper gives examples like Iceland or the Centre National de la Musique showing different thresholds. Some programs require thousands of streams or partner co-investment, showing how music export organizations end up balancing inclusivity against wanting reasonable chances of success. And what's important to remember is that despite the criteria used by music export organizations, there is an industry behind, especially showcase festivals and other structures that will act as gatekeepers anyway. So that's the nature of the creative economy.
You suggest MEOs could be a tool for inclusive soft power. What does inclusive soft power mean in this context, and how does it differ from traditional soft power?
Yes, so that was actually one of the trigger of this research, because I knew a lot of traditional cultural diplomacy, and I thought that export was actually showing the path for a sort of new kind, more maybe economically based diplomacy or soft power. So if you think of traditional soft power as nation branding via prestige culture, like big orchestras, film festivals, diplomacy and cultural institutes, they're often top-down and selective. But export work in a different way. Inclusive soft power is, in this way, would be more bottom up and ecosystem oriented. It's about widening who gets to circulate internationally, popular music genres, different languages, and actually many music export initiatives, they don't focus on a specific kind of music or a specific kind of identity. They're way more broad than traditional soft power tools. And maybe the next step would be, because the problem with export is that it's a one-way tool. It's not, internationalization is more reciprocal in its nature as a concept. So that's where, if we wanted to take export to a more inclusive stage, that would be about building reciprocity and cross-border networks and treating cultural exchange as mutual rather than purely promotional. So that's what many music export organizations try to do, even if it's not really in their agenda, but that's really what is in their values. And when you see music export organizations building networks like the European one, the European Music Exporters Exchange, they have these questions of inclusivity and reciprocity on the table all the time. They're always talking about all these things, and not so much about return on investments and things like that. So that's also why the article positions music export organizations as hybrid instruments that can foster a more inclusive approach. But of course, they have strong limitations for that.
Yeah. And many MEOs operate at the crossroads of culture, trade, and foreign policy. How do they navigate sometimes conflicting agendas from these policy domains?
So yeah, the paper documents that approximately 60% of public funding for music export organizations comes from cultural ministries. And actually the links to foreign or trade ministries are quite marginal, and that mismatch creates unclear expectations, especially because of the use of the term export. Cultural ministries focus on artistic or cultural development, and they try to improve their business approach, but they're not professional or I mean, they are professional, but they're not expert in that domain. While trade and foreign ministries, they look for economic returns or eventually diplomatic leverage. But as we know, if you're a global cultural expert, these phenomena, they're never that direct. You cannot expect a return on investment on a short-term basis. And you also have to understand that cultural sectors, especially music sectors, they're full of like very small and medium companies, and they're in many cases they're very organized. They have unions, they have networks. So if you create a policy only focused on return on investments, they will disagree and they will raise their voice. So if you want music export organizations to credibly deliver across all these goals, funding and governance need to match the mandate, either by a clearer division of labor, cultural funds, cultural development, trade funds, foreign affairs supports, which is not the case for now, or pooled coordinated funding that explicitly accepts hybrid aims and gives music export organizations longer term or stable resources to pursue all these objectives. For now, it's not the case. So the article suggests that stronger autonomy and mission clarity and more cross-ministerial cooperation, rather than simply dumping music export organizations into trade ministries, would be interesting. And a joint funding stream or a formal cross-ministry steering group could reduce this mission drift and ensure metrics align with what music export organizations realistically can deliver.
You propose 3 archetypes: public cultural agency, independent industrial-led export hub, and grassroots facilitators. In your view, which model is most resilient and effective in the long term, and why?
That's a very good question. You know, initially when I started this research, I was only focused on France and Spain, especially Catalonia. And maybe I'm biased, I don't know, but I think because those places, they have public cultural agencies as music export organizations. They're fully publicly funded, well funded. They have long-term visions. So I would tend for a model like that. It doesn't mean that they can't be collaborations with the private sectors, especially with performing rights societies and other institutions. But at some point, I think there should be a strong public agency, because they have political legitimacy, they have larger and more stable budgets, They have institutional visibility and capacity to coordinate with other public and private actors. So they're better placed to pursue long-term strategies that balance culture, trade, and soft power. But in the end, the best outcome is always hybrid. The public agency ability and policy reach, but industry hubs, they bring market know-how and networks, while the last archetype, the grassroots facilitator, maintain a strong scene legitimacy and diversity, is also very important. So let's say that the article emphasizes a continuum and the value of each form. So while the public agency can be more resilient institutionally, an ecosystem that combines all three with real cooperation, I think, is the most effective in practice.
And looking at the iconic case of South Korea, what is the single most important lesson European policymakers should learn from it? Do you think it can be replicated in Europe or anywhere else, like in Turkey?
Yes, so that's a good question, and it's always good, I think, to take the case of South Korea, not necessarily as a best practice, but at least as a reference, and try to understand how we can replicate, what we can replicate, what we cannot. And the core lesson for me is that long-term coordinated state investment and delegation to industry works, or it can work. K-pop, in a way, shows that these sustained strategic public support combined with industry capability and professionalization, of course, can achieve through training pipelines, export strategy, and global marketing. They can achieve a lot. So the article stresses this: South Korea invested structurally and delegated implementation to industry, and the state, while the state set goals and the private sectors executed that scale. Can Europe replicate it, or Turkey? I don't think it's possible to do it in the very same way, for many reasons, because South Korea is also a strongly industrial hub, and it is in a geopolitical situation that is very, very different. And the relationship with the cultural ecosystem is also very different, very top down in the case of South Korea. Europe's cultural diversity, decentralized policymaking and cultural scenes, the fact that we also have smaller single market languages and also strong protection for artistic autonomy mean that a South Korea style centralized and, let's say it, exploitative pop export machine is unlikely and perhaps undesirable. But Europe and Turkey can learn the strategic bits, which are, as I said, invest long-term, coordinate across ministries, support industry professionalization and career pipelines, and fund structural ecosystem building. Funding structural ecosystems is very important rather than one-off initiatives. That's for sure.
The article ends by suggesting the strengthening MEOs autonomy could help counter a fully market-driven vision. And can you sum it up, elaborate on what a viable, sustainable, non-market-driven model for international music circulation might look like? You already mentioned, but to sum it up.
Well, yes, I think it will have to be built on three pillars, and looks less like a sales team and more like a small ecosystem builder. So first, I think mission clarity with mixed funding, public and private, and a stable funding would be way more viable or sustainable. For instance, multi-year budgets and grants coming from different ministries would allow music export organizations to plan beyond immediate and short-term actions, especially at showcase festivals, which is where I have another article coming on that topic, where we analyze the relationship between music export organizations and showcase festivals that have, and these festivals have become the main platform for music export organizations to justify their actions. So it's where the institutional dimension sometimes dominate and doesn't serve like a more sustainable ecosystemic vision of music export. And it's because they have these short-term and limitations in a way, and they have to justify all the time what they do. So, and actually, if you look at these festivals, you will see that the Centre National de la Musique, which is probably the music export organization that has most funding, they don't need this whole branding and stuff, because they're just there to support music professionals, but it like in the backstage in a way. They don't have to show their institutional brand or anything like that. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is a better way to measure music export and music export success. But this is very hard, because let's say that first, we don't know how to really measure music export revenue, because it has so many streams, from IP to streaming live, etc. It's really hard. We've tried with Virgo. We have another actually research project on that, and it's very hard. So every time you hear something about the way the creative industries are performing abroad, you have to be very skeptical about it, because it's very hard to measure. So we need better tools on the one hand, and on the other hand, we also need maybe a more inclusive or a more complex way to measure export, using cultural exchange, reciprocity, diversity, and capacity building outcomes, not just revenue. And this is also hard, because you probably know, in the creative industries, we always talk about social impact and things like that, but to measure it concretely is always a big challenge. So actually, on the revenue side, I developed a survey with a French network called Zone to measure the impact of showcase festivals on participants. But this is mainly on the revenue side. For the rest, it would need, I think, a completely new framework of analysis. So that's the second pillar. And the third pillar, I think, would be a sort of distributed ecosystem with a lot of autonomy, but also a capacity to build innovative partnerships. Because what I was saying about the public agency model, agency is very flexible in how it collaborates with the industry and other institutions. So Actually, the best would be a publicly funded agency that also has the aspects of the two other archetypes, which is connected to the grassroots part of the industry with cultural legitimacy, diversity, but also works as an industry hub with collaborating with the strong professional networks and institutions. So in that case, autonomy would mean that music export organizations can prioritize inclusion and reciprocity, even if short-term commercial returns are not very certain. So yeah, that would be the perfect situation, let's say, and sustainable model anyway.
Actually, last year I was writing this article, and it was more like a theoretical one with cultural diplomacy and the role of music in cultural diplomacy. And after I read your article, I was reading my article again and transforming it into more like music export offices, because me and Sherif are always talking about that. We don't have music export offices.
Yeah.
But we have, maybe you know that we have this movie export in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's really like big thing now in Turkey, and also in the digital game industry. We have a really big export. So I really think that music can follow these two, especially the movie.
Yeah.
So we are trying to like create this Turkey music export strategy and the music export office framework, and your article really opened a lot of good points for us.
Yeah, I mean, we can keep the conversation open, because sure. I think the right way to approach it is more like a music exchange platform or music exchange office or music exchange agency, something like that, because this idea of exchange, it's not only about the utopian reciprocity between all the countries, it's also creating a dialogue with what's happening on abroad and what's happening in the local ecosystem. In many ways, the music export business is a niche business. There's only a few music professionals in each country that know how to export, and in many cases, artists, when they have an international potential, they go with the global players based in the UK or in the US. Yeah. So if you have an export industry in your country, it's probably a very niche one, if you have one. So that's the first step, to recognize what's the export business like. And then when you want to build an institutional thing around it and around internationalization, you also have to think about how you import music and how incoming music productions can support your local ecosystem, which is happening a lot in France in the movie sector, right? Every time we have an international movie, there's this tax on the tickets that fund local production. So it's hard to create something like that. France can do it, but for many countries it's impossible. But what you can do is create incentives where you can receive more international productions being produced in your country. So it creates, of course, economic impact, but also collaborations between international players and your local ecosystem. So in that case, like these incentives, like the ones that exist in the movie sector, they could be included in this music exchange platform. But if it's only about export, sometimes it falls a little bit short. But again, I understand why the term export has been used so much, because it's a way to replace or occupy the territory of soft power with this economic agenda, saying that you will create impact and jobs and blah, blah, blah. even though when you actually know the export business, you know it's a very small business, but symbolically it has a great impact. But I think it's also tricky, because when you want to build an institutional framework around export, it falls a little bit short again. And if you know the cultural sector, especially, like, of course you always have this entrepreneurial part of the cultural sector that wants to have an impact, that wants to create revenue. But a big part of the cultural sector is a bit reluctant about to think about music or culture in terms of export, in terms of return on investment, because not only because they don't know how to do that, how to have an economic impact, but also because it's not what they are looking for. So it's always tricky to use that term export, and I think exchange is a broader term that you can use to build an institutional framework that is about economic impact, but not only. And you win the trust from your policymaker and from your local cultural sector, even the nonprofit one, creating this dialogue that includes soft power or diplomacy, trade, and cultural development.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Let's keep in touch, and yeah, have a nice week. Bye-bye.
Please. Bye.